An affordable housing. Oh yes, we are recording. And this is an Affordable Housing Month event in partnership with Silicon Valley at Home. And before we dive in to introduce our esteemed panelists and go through the kind of rule or format overview today, I'd like to introduce Regina Celestin Williams, who is here with us from Silicon Valley at Home. And maybe next slide, please. Regina, take it away.
Thank you so much, Elaine. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so excited to see you all here as a part of Affordable Housing Month. I am Regina Celestin Williams, the Executive Director of SB at Home, and we're a membership organization that works to see and realize a community in Silicon Valley where everyone can live and thrive. The theme for this year's Affordable Housing Month, which we host in Santa Clara County, is building community. So really excited about this event with Van Meter Williams Pollock about the city of San Jose and its design guidelines. We hope to reinforce our relationships with people, neighborhoods, and local partners committed to making housing justice a reality. At SV at Home, we recognize that every supporter of Affordable Housing Month plays such a critical role in shaping our communities so that they are diverse, affordable, equitable, and accessible for all. So this is such a perfect event for us to have this year during Affordable Housing Month. We just want to emphasize the need for all of us to deepen our commitment to this work and lay the building blocks of a future that we can only construct together. So you all being here today is really a sign of your commitment to not just the city of San Jose, but to Santa Clara County and all of us who live here. So with that, again, thank you to Van Meter Williams Pollock for putting on this event, and I'll turn it back to Elaine. I'm excited to be a part of this event.
Thanks, Regina. And I'm sorry I didn't introduce myself, but my name's Elaine Wong. I'm going to be moderating today. I'm with Van Meter Williams Pollock. We are an architecture and urban design firm based in San Francisco, and obviously involved with the San Jose Design Guide Standards and Design Guidelines, which you will hear more about today. Before we'll be hearing from Ruchira Gaur, who's one of our associates here at Van Meter Williams Pollock and a senior urban designer. Timothy Rood, who was formerly the planning division manager for the city of San Jose, but is now with the community development director for the city of Hercules, and Carla Violet, senior associate with Urban Planning Partners. Just a quick word about format. What we'd like to do is we'd like to give our presenters time to dive into the content. So we'll be having them present their presentation first. If you have questions along the way, could you please enter them into the chat? If you can send them to either myself or to everyone, that would be great. And we will be sure to batch them up and come back to the questions after Ruchira, Timothy, and Carla have been able to present. So appreciate your patience, but we have a lot to get through, and we would love to just allow the three of them to present. So I'm going to do a quick introduction of just going through their biographies, and then we'll have them take it away. So Ruchira Gaur is an urban designer with a strong background in architecture, and her work focuses on community building, theme of the month, sustainability and responsible growth. She leads urban design projects for VMWP, including the San Jose Citywide Standards and Guidelines, which won an American Planning Association Award for urban design. She focuses on quick feasibility studies, 3D modeling and visualization, and 3D printing to help clients understand the full potential of a project site. And she's just amazing. You'll hear all from her soon. Timothy Rood, who was formerly the planning division manager of the city of San Jose, is now the community development director for the city of Hercules. And while he was at San Jose, he oversaw the standards and guidelines document and the updated Diridon Station area plan, which were the entitlements for Google's 80-acre downtown west mixed-use plan. Before entering city service, Tim was a planning and urban design consultant for 20 years, and as both principal at Calthorpe Associates and community design and architecture. And last but not least is Carla Violet, who's a senior associate with Urban Planning Partners, and she has 10 years of experience in planning policy, contract planning, environmental review, and she has managed housing element updates, specific plans, station area plans, with outreach and CEQA processes. And throughout her career, she's been focused on equitable access to housing, transportation, and economic development. So, can't wait to hear from all three of you, and I will let you guys take it away.
Great. Well, I thank you all for being here today. I'm excited to share some of the insights and experiences we had when developing this guidance document. So this is just a kind of an overview of today's program. We're going to start with some background on the process and the funding that enabled us to update all the city's design guidance documents and some of the state law considerations behind the update. Then we'll talk about the process and approach of developing the new document. Then Ruchira is going to lead us through kind of the deep dive, the advertised deep dive into the document itself and kind of how it's organized, what the design and guiding principles behind it are. And then we're going to touch on affordable housing, since that's the whole theme of this, and then hopefully leave lots of time for Q&A. So next, please. Updating the city's design guidance was actually a priority of the San Jose City Council. So when I came on board in 2017, I was in a grant-funded position as the city's kind of urban design lead, which is something it hadn't had before. And so we had this council priority to update all of these documents, and at the time, a pretty limited amount of city funding. So one of the first things I did was develop a funding and phasing strategy to get through all of these updates. As you'll hear, the existing guidance was really old, 20 to 30 years old. And while good for its time, it didn't meet today's requirements or address a lot of the conditions that we deal with today. So there were several grants, and I want to acknowledge and thank all of our funders. So the Knight Foundation initially funded my position as city designer, as well as a second grant specifically for the design guidelines update. That funded the update of the downtown design standards and guidelines. That document was adopted in 2019. And at that point, with our funding exhausted, we went to MTC and obtained a PDA staffing grant, which allowed us to access their on-call bench, including UPP and VMWP. So if you haven't used it, that's a great program that can provide not just in-house staff, but also staffing assistance to pull off complex projects like this with resources the city may not have in-house. So grateful to both Knight Foundation and MTC for making these updates possible. Next. And so the MTC PDA staffing grant was awarded in 2018 and enabled us to access this expert consultant team. And the scope of the update was originally to update the residential and commercial design guidelines. Thanks to the collaboration with the consulting team, we were able to work within the grant amount to include the industrial design guidelines as well. And you'll see a couple examples of those later. Next. The update process for this document was updating and combining multiple city documents. We had industrial design guidelines from '92, commercial design guidelines from 1990, residential design guidelines from 1997. All of those got combined and updated into this new document. We also had other sets of design guidelines related to specific what are called urban villages, mixed use areas, and specific plans and other area plans that we had to kind of take into account. Next.
I'm going to jump in and give a bit more context behind the need for the cities to adopt objective design standards. So to address the housing shortage, the state introduced two bills that many of you may already be familiar with. The first was Senate Bill 35, the Affordable Housing Streamlined Approval, and that aimed to increase housing supply by requiring cities to streamline their approvals for certain types of projects. And eligible housing projects were required to meet a range of criteria, which included meeting objective design standards in place at the time of submittal for application. And then the second bill was Senate Bill 330, the Housing Crisis Act of 2019. And the goal behind this bill was to provide a more predictable development process and speed up that review process for new housing. Also to preserve existing affordable housing and prevent downzoning or other types of actions that could potentially reduce housing supply. So if a project is consistent with objective standards, a city would not be able to reduce the density or deny the project unless certain findings were met. Next slide, please. So what exactly are objective design standards? Design standards are objective if they are measurable, verifiable, and knowable to all parties prior to project submittal. And the review process should not involve any personal or subjective judgment. Typically, language used for objective design standards are shall, must, or required to. In contrast, more subjective design guidelines often require interpretation and discretion, and the language is often less enforceable, so using words like should or may. So the purpose of these standards is for applicants to know before they submit what requirements apply to a development so that they can design the project to meet those requirements.
All right. So the stakeholder and community engagement was a big part of this process, and I want to thank and acknowledge the project manager, Leila Hakimizadeh, who really organized and facilitated a lot of these outreach sessions. So San Jose has a city council policy on public outreach that requires major projects to have at least 2 community workshops. So we fulfilled that. We actually had 3, and because COVID happened in the middle of this process, we were able to have one kind of listening session up front in the fall of 2019. But then once we had a draft document, we were into virtual COVID world. So we had 2 virtual community workshops in July of 2020. Then we had study sessions with the city's advisory bodies, the Historic Landmarks Commission, which specifically worked on some of the standards and guidelines for historic buildings and areas. Then with the Planning Commission, we had several focus group meetings with developers and designers, as well as individual community organizations and architects. Especially want to thank David Baker Architects for taking a really sharpening their pencils and taking a very close read of the document and providing some very valuable comments to ensure that we weren't impinging on the feasibility of development, particularly for affordable housing. So grateful for that. It was a real collaboration. Next, please. So some of the considerations, right? San Jose is a huge city. It's about 190 square miles. It's the largest city in the Bay Area. I don't know why we don't call it the San Jose Bay Area. And it has a 2011 general plan that lays out a really ambitious strategy to kind of transform it from a largely suburban community to a real urban community that's oriented around light rail and other forms of transit. So the orange areas on the map are urban villages. There are over 80 of them, and many of them have been designated but not formally planned. They don't have an approved urban village plan. So we had to take a lot of different types of conditions into account. In addition to that, we looked at the city's experience with common development prototypes, kind of what were some of the issues that were coming up repeatedly in the designs and what were the things we were trying to correct. So we have, growth areas, which include both the employment areas shown in gray and the urban villages shown in orange. So we did make some tweaks in the document to kind of up the standards a bit in the areas that were intended to be more pedestrian oriented. Next, please.
So creating the values and guiding principles was truly an iterative process, and it evolved over the life of the project. The design team initially distilled these from the existing city documents and past community engagement, and then vetted through the robust community engagement process that Tim just mentioned for this specific document. So ultimately, we didn't want this to read like a document that could apply anywhere. These guidelines and values needed to really be reflective of the San Jose community by emphasizing the sense of place, geography, socioeconomic characteristics, and the culture. So extra emphasis was placed on equity, diversity, and inclusiveness. This was an important part of the document. Next slide, please.
So as Carla mentioned that it was really important for us to maintain these guiding principles and values. We also wanted to make sure that this document does not conflict with the zoning or change the zoning in any way. What it's supposed to do is only raise the bar of the design of the next generation of development. So this document predominantly has design standards, which are design requirements for all kinds of developments citywide, and then also has some design guidelines and an extensive amount of graphics to encourage and lead with examples. The graphics that we had in this document are intentionally non-stylistic because the standards needed to focus on the fundamental principles, and they do not use a particular building style. A specific style is not the important point of these standards. Many styles can achieve the design goals. You can have bays in a traditional style and also in a contemporary style. But what's important is to be able to use these design elements to articulate a building facade. So in this document, what we did is we started from a bigger picture, looking at the site, its context, and then diving deeper into building design and the finer grained pedestrian level treatments to maintain a pleasant environment. Also, one thing is that we designed this document to be very user-friendly so that anyone from any kind of design level experience can follow through. So we started looking at this with a few key design principles that are applicable to all kinds of building types. Site planning and organization is the first and foremost. It is very crucial to understand the context of a site, where it's located, its surroundings, its local infrastructure, its relationship to transit. So the way that we created these standards is to require locating primary building entrances close to frequent transit stops, which would promote an active lifestyle and focus on bikes and pedestrian access. It would also require the bicycle and pedestrian entries in the site and in the development to be located so that they can avoid intersecting or getting interrupted by vehicular traffic. The other key design principle that we looked at was parking and location of parking and treatment of parking. Parking is a necessary evil. It is important, we all know that, but it also is notorious for negatively impacting the pedestrian realm. And it kind of creates sort of unsafe places for people to walk around in the city. So we require the buildings to be oriented along the street and parking to be located behind the buildings or be concealed by wrapping it with residential and commercial uses. It's sort of like if you don't get this right, then it doesn't matter so much what the building looks like. The building might look great, but it's going to fail the urban fabric, the city fabric, and the comfort that a pedestrian might have walking around in the city. The other design principle, which sort of connects to the previous one that we were talking about, is that we wanted to have active frontages and transparency along the ground floor, again, to sort of promote the active lifestyle and to promote more pedestrian activity in the streets of San Jose. So the standards require a considerable portion of the ground floor to be lined with active frontages, such as building lobbies, common areas, fitness rooms, all of them along the street. They also require minimizing the blank walls to help convert any kind of uninviting spaces into more safe places that the pedestrians would feel comfortable walking through. In addition to locating any active uses along the street, it is also important to create transparent building facades at that level so that it's easy to create an engaging street where pedestrians can see the activities that are happening inside of the building, especially for retail and commercial purposes. And for residential development, what it would mean is that we would provide common areas with large transparent windows so that there's sort of an indoor-outdoor relationship for the building occupants. And also the pedestrians can look inside and see what all fun activities are happening. And then also providing a lot of ground floor residential units. They would not have that many transparent windows, but they would have stoops and frequent entrances, which would help create sort of eyes on the street, again, creating more inviting and comfortable environment for people to walk by and also create more engaging streets. Then we started looking at the buildings and building massing and articulation. And we wanted to make sure that the new buildings still respect the existing buildings, the existing maybe low density developments, and the massing needed to respond to that. The zoning might allow a larger building envelope, but design is where we start looking at building articulation and then having bays, like I was mentioning earlier, in window patterns and material changes, how the ground floor is treated so that it looks more inviting for building inhabitants and also passersby. Last but not the least, we also focused on sustainability and how future developments would respond to climate change. We have standards and guidelines for how to design open spaces, such as POPOs, which are privately owned public open spaces, paseos, and common open spaces. We have standards regarding stormwater retention and use of low impact development techniques to preserve water for landscaping and use them in the most efficient way possible. And in addition to that, we also talk about building orientation, shading devices such as awnings and sunshades, and how much they should shade the building and the windows, the clear glazing, to reduce the solar heat gain. We also discuss roof treatment and the treatment of parking areas, the surface parking areas, parking again, to reduce the solar heat gain island effect, the solar heat island effect, and make sure that our landscaping is able to shade most of it, and then in turn reduce the solar heat gain, making our developments more energy efficient. And also, we wanted to make sure that it works with the state requirements of energy efficiency as well. So we had to keep all of that in mind. And then we also included prototypes for each building typology that the city has or would want to have in the future. We focused on residential, commercial, and industrial typologies since we were combining all of the three documents, as Tim mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. We discussed missing middle and conversion of existing single family houses to duplexes, going all the way up to sixplexes, changing the use of these buildings from residential to commercial, and what are the design standards and guidelines that should be followed or kept in mind while doing so. And in illustrating these prototypes, we provide references all the way throughout the document that are related and are most important design elements. While creating these diagrams and prototypes and mentioning all of these examples, we made sure to remove style from the equation. As I was sort of mentioning earlier, that you can have same kind of design elements in a very traditional style, but also in a very contemporary style. And what that made us do is just focus on what is fundamentally important. All the key design principles that we discussed are the fundamentally important design elements, prioritizing the site planning, building entrances, massing and articulation, and the street frontage and active spaces and transparency. All that, if we are able to address those, it doesn't matter so much anything else, everything just would fall into place.
And the prototypes are not new standards that only apply to one particular building typology. I think that's an important point. The standards live in the front end of the document, and they're organized by topic, from the site to the building to the pedestrian realm. And then they're illustrated with references back to the standards and guidelines, for these different development typologies. So we didn't want to create a situation where I don't know if this project is a townhouse or a cottage court or a small lot single family cluster. I don't know which section to look in. It doesn't matter which section to look in. You just need to address the standards related to building location, entrances, articulation, et cetera. So that's one of the ways. I saw a question in the chat about this. That's one of the ways that we were able to try to provide good guidance for so many different conditions and uses. So the kind staff at San Jose Department of Planning, Building, Code Enforcement in the Development Review Group were kind enough to provide some examples of either recently approved or projects under review under the citywide guidelines. So I don't know a lot about these projects. I left the city over a year ago, but I see that Cora McNaughton, who used to be on one of the teams that reported up to me, is here. So we can do your best to answer these questions about these specific projects, but we mostly just wanted to give you a flavor of kind of what kinds of things are coming in and being evaluated. So this is sort of a typical urban village building. A lot of the urban villages have a minimum commercial requirement for every site. So you're not allowed to build just a straight residential building, particularly for the ones where an urban village plan has not yet been adopted. There's kind of a special lane that you can get your project into if it provides a lot of amenities and meets a certain threshold requirement for commercial, which might require more than just the ground floor being retail. It might require office uses on the second or third floor. So those types of multiple mixed use buildings are challenging to finance and construct and operate. But that's sort of what the urban village strategy calls for. Because San Jose, being a kind of the largest bedroom community and certainly the bedroom community of Silicon Valley, has been really creative about trying to find ways to maintain its job base while adding housing and to kind of try to improve its jobs to housing ratio. So this mixed-use building replaced an existing office building, so they would therefore be required to replace that office square footage within the mixed-use structure. I think the minimum commercial FAR was 0.2. So typically you can't accommodate that just on the ground floor alone. It's a 6-story building. So you see that 7,200 square feet of retail on the ground floor, and then another 7,000 square feet of office on the floors above, and 50 residential units, all with one level of underground parking. And I think what you can see the guidelines doing here is certainly the massing and articulation of the facades. It's a little hard to tell what the ground floor facades look like, but assuming that that's glazing, you have that transparency. The standards, we don't have standards for building color. We have guidelines for it. There was kind of a lot of pushback about the idea of actually regulating building color. So I'm hoping that this is sort of a preliminary massing study and not the final color scheme, but you never know. Let's take a look at another one. Okay, so this was an interesting project. This came in while I was still there, and this was a medical office complex with Kaiser as the intended tenant. out in one of the really outlying urban villages, right next to a major surface level expressway, Capitol Expressway. So the general plan and kind of the city's policies call for these grand boulevards that are, you know, mixed use, pedestrian oriented major thoroughfares that connect neighborhoods. And some of them are currently in really kind of an expressway format, like almost like a freeway down on the ground. And Capitol Expressway is one of those. So we had a lot of discussions about how the, you know, it's a medical facility. It needs to have an ambulance, you know, drop-off area. You know, there are a lot of specific requirements. It's not just a regular office building. So we worked with them to, that's kind of a parking street. You can't see my pointer, can you? But in the upper right-hand image, the sort of triangular wedge, that's actually an out parcel, not part of the project. And then behind it is a parking garage. So you can see how the parking garage with the, you know, doesn't have the active frontage. That's sort of relegated to the interior of the site. And the building is placed at the corner of the, you know, the street leading into the urban village, and then the major expressway that sort of forms its boundary. And you can see the massing and articulation and material changes on the building. There's actually some outdoor areas on the corner of those two major streets. Yeah, I can see somebody's mouse in there. So that we worked with them to turn that into kind of an outdoor, you know, eating area, and provide a little more of human scale and interest on that corner. Next, please. And then this one is interesting. So this is even in industrial areas, the standards and guidelines are aimed at incrementally creating a more pedestrian and transit-oriented environment as sites redevelop over time. So this is a warehouse and distribution facility in an industrial area, but you can see the effect that the standards and guidelines had in terms of the building articulation, and you know, the basic principle for these kinds of facilities is to put whatever the most active component is, usually the front office, you know, wherever the sort of main entrance of this facility is, and wherever the people are most likely to be, place that on your kind of most active frontage or corner. And so you can see that in the left-hand image there. Next, please. So, you know, to circle back to affordable housing, these guidelines cover, you know, the entire city. So they cover all forms of residential, well, outside of the downtown, which has its own document. So they're covering both affordable and market rate housing. We talked a bit about the specific guidance for the missing middle housing types. So that's really aimed at kind of, you know, upping the quality of the, and kind of trying to minimize the neighborhood impacts of those missing middle forms of housing that are potentially more kind of naturally affordable, naturally occurring affordable housing, as opposed to tax credit, you know, capital A affordable housing. But the larger multifamily affordable projects are also subject to these same guidelines and standards. So we were interested and asked staff what some of the waivers and concessions affordable projects were taking advantage of under state law. And so, you know, they're much the same as they had been before this document, you know, parking exceptions, height exceptions, the setbacks and stepbacks, setbacks being set by the zoning, and the stepbacks being those kind of tapering daylight plane kind of curves. Those are some of the areas where exceptions and concessions have been, or waivers and concessions have been requested. And then also the private and common open space, which were, the city had a very detailed set of standards for how much open space each of the per unit, each of those different housing typologies required. And kind of what had happened was that nobody's really building townhouses in San Jose. The land values are too high. No, certainly nobody's building, you know, detached cluster cottage courts really in San Jose, that the land is too valuable. So they had kind of lost some relevance. But yeah, so, you know, the goal here was to create a quality and equitable, you know, urban environment for all, and to have standards and guidelines in place that would allow for some of these waivers and concessions to occur while still maintaining that quality environment. And then in closing, I'll mention that both of the downtown and the citywide guidelines and standards documents included an exception process. where a standard, it says that the standards are mandatory and must be met, but there is a process baked in that allows the director or the planning director or whoever the decision-making body is, it might be the planning commission or the council, depending on the type of approval, they can make a finding that the site is, and has some unique constraint that prevents realization of that particular standard, as long as sort of findings can be met that they're meeting the other standards and kind of doing their best to address the spirit of the guidelines. We thought that that would provide adequate kind of flexibility for unique projects and conditions. What we found, and this was probably more the case downtown, but large commercial projects, especially downtown office buildings, felt constrained by some of the numeric standards, especially those relating to floor plate size. We show that you could accommodate a 60,000 foot office floor plate, under these standards, but some of them wanted 65, so they ended up, the city ended up amending the process essentially, and to allow for a sort of universal override of a particular standard if there are countervailing considerations that warrant or that justify the exception. So in other words, like a little more, we're trying to be very firm about what is required, what is desirable, and then how you can get around a unique constraint. We found that architects and designers were very creative in coming up with arguments why their site had some unique constraint that, and we did grant a lot of exceptions kind of at the administrative level, but then there were, some key projects that kind of pushed this issue of, well, okay, but can't the council just override this and let us do our project? So I think that's the last slide, if I'm not mistaken, and we are now going to transition into the Q&A.
Yes, thank you guys. And I think you sort of touched on a few things that I was going to ask you just to get it started, but we've got some good questions in the chat. And I think the first one is about how do you address so many uses and development types in such a small document? Do you want to? Yeah,
and kind of, what I think, I'm interested in what Ruchira and Carla's thoughts on this are as well. But I think, again, we try to kind of almost do it by function, so in rather than by use or by, by typology per se. We provided examples of how the standards and guidelines apply to different typologies, but we really focused on the universal principles. So in some ways, it's kind of like a form-based code. We're somewhat indifferent as to the use, but what we really care about is that pedestrian realm.
Yeah, thanks for that, Tim. And exactly, I just want to add on to that. It is through experience, like the firm that we are working at, that I'm working at, VMWP, they have so much experience designing affordable housing developments for over so many years, and then also some other examples. And we had consulted with so many other architectural firms that have experience working with commercial and some with industrial developments also. So what we did was understand the requirements for each of those buildings around these fundamental principles that we discussed earlier in this presentation, like building massing and building entrances and relationship between the building and the pedestrian realm. And all of that is what we focused on instead of just the building typologies. And if there were slight differences related to a certain building type or typology, we would just add a side note, additional standards for these kind of developments, and then we would mention those. So that's how we were able to keep it consistent and brief.
I would just add, much better than having 3 separate, much longer documents to have to go through. And so definitely some efficiencies by having them all in one.
Oh, and one thing I should have mentioned is that San Jose does not have any kind of a design review committee, and most projects, many major projects can be approved at what's called a director's hearing. So they may never see the planning commission or council if there isn't a development agreement or some other conditional use permit or something that has to go. So if it's kind of a by right development, the design review is all done at the staff level. And San Jose staff is great, but there is quite a bit of turnover. So you've constantly got, young new planners coming in, and the previous guidelines were kind of written for architects, and they talked a lot about considering certain things. Well, so what's a planner looking at a project supposed to say? Well, did they consider where, well, I don't know if they considered it or not. I know what I can see on the plan. So we tried very hard to make the objective standards really, just that, objective, so that anybody could easily tell whether they were being met or not.
Same with the glossary. I think that was so helpful to have at the end, just so you can look up some of these words are very jargony if you're not a designer. So you can just go back and look at that definition and in layman's terms to understand what you're reviewing for.
Sorry, did any other comments on that question? No. We've got a really good question as well from Lucas Ramirez, and who wants to know, to what extent has the city's cost of development analysis and the financial feasibility analysis informed the development of the design standards and guidelines?
Yeah, great question. And hi, Lucas. Glad you could join us today. Yeah, so the city, the Economic Development Department and the city manager's office did a pretty extensive, deep dive into development feasibility in San Jose, which was part of sort of a council discussion about, to what extent could lowering fees help to, enhance the feasibility of development. At the time, especially during the COVID recession, there were a lot of types of development that really weren't penciling out very well in San Jose. I think in terms of the standards and guidelines, we really looked at what had been built in the past couple of decades, and the different types of construction that we were seeing come in as planning applications. We certainly took a development feasibility lens, knowing that every sort of bump and grind that you mandate a building envelope take is going to add cost, right? Every corner is adding cost. Every bay is adding cost. Every roof articulations, definitely wet decks, right? If some of you are architects, when you step a building back and create habitable space on top of, outdoor space on top of indoor space, you create a real potential for water intrusion that requires very careful design and can open the project up to liability if it's not maintained properly. So all of those things, and then we had our focus groups with architects and developers who gave us a lot of feedback, as well as, folks in the city's economic development department that have been working with these developers. We got very clear and pointed comments from some of the economic development staff that, why do you have a block size standard for industrial areas? There's no reason to do that. So that was an example of one of the things that we took out. Oh, hey, Cora, I just saw your comment about the checklist. That's awesome.
Great. And Janet's question was, what kind of resources help the applicant and city staff review development proposals? Was a checklist included? And looks like you've got the checklist included. Do you guys want to talk a little bit about that process? And Cora, we can unmute you if you want to say something about how, how it's going. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I just was going to mention, I was looking back through our files actually, because I think this was in 2018. We had kind of put together a memo looking at other example checklists and provided sort of like, here's what we think would be the most useful, and pass that on to the city. But maybe Tim can also speak to what happened.
Anything to add, Tim?
No, this is the first time I've seen this checklist.
Yeah. After the project.
How it's working out.
Great. Well, we have another question from Alok asking about what he's interested in. What kind of additional guidelines did you look at to ensure the success of ground floor residential stoops in urban high density environments? And he's thinking through security, privacy, balancing street pedestrian vibrancy with all those elements.
Yeah, that's a great question, Alok. And, definitely we would hear from developers, oh, we can't do any ground floor facing units or open space or stoops because of security concerns. And we'd always have to kind of push a little bit like, well, okay, what are the specific concerns and what kinds of crime prevention through environmental design principles could maybe be used to address those concerns without just walling off the entire street. I think there's a whole, there's a whole section of the guidelines about these kind of ground floor residential units, right? I think there might actually be a kind of a page on it that potentially we could bring up if somebody has the document handy. But I guess in principle, we set what we thought was a, realistic but achievable but ambitious standard for how much ground floor residential entrances you needed to have if you have ground floor units. In terms of accessibility, which is a huge issue, right? It's desirable to have some vertical separation between your ground floor units and the street level, just for privacy and noise and other things. But then that essentially means you have to create a parallel accessible path into the unit, usually from the other side. So kind of we looked at the, and having expert architects who do this a lot on the team was helpful in kind of looking at, okay, what are the ADA implications of this particular standard? And again, this is another case where feedback from architects was really valuable. I recall that there's kind of a prohibition on what you see a lot, which are kind of like backyard spaces up against the street, where individual units have kind of a little, wall, high fenced kind of open space area for their barbecue, but it's right next to the sidewalk. So we encourage those to be more in, courtyards or kind of more internal to the site, and then have those kind of more stoop or, front entrance elements on the street. It could be recessed in a little courtyard, but it would need to be a common open space as opposed to just for one unit.
Yeah, and in addition to that, we also provided minimum sizing for that space to be usable. Actually, like you can put out a couple of chairs, a small table, and enjoy the pedestrian realm, the public realm also. And we also have standards regarding the heights of the railings and any kind of walls that are provided in that area to ensure that there's a sense of privacy, but also that we do have eyes on the street from the inside of the building to the outside. So those were also some of the things.
Are there any other questions from the audience? Thank you for being respectful of the presenters and putting them in the chat. But if you do have something and you want to raise your hand, we're happy to take your question live since we've got a few more minutes. Nothing. See, everything is so clear.
Well, I actually have a question for Cora, if she doesn't mind unmuting, about the checklist. I'm kind of looking at the section called "Is the standard required?" and it has boxes for yes, no, and not applicable. I understand yes, and I understand not applicable, but when can you check the no box for a particular standard?
That's a good question. We didn't really think about that. I think the idea was just yes, no, not applicable was sort of what you would expect to see.
Yeah.
So, but good point. So that came out of, I've been with the city a little bit over a year, and I came from LA where we didn't have great design guidelines, and we didn't have a checklist except for the small lot design guidelines, which are very detailed and have a really good checklist. So I used that as the model. And basically the idea was it takes a long time to go through all of these. Obviously not everything is applicable to every project, but really for the planner, going through the plans and trying to identify where exactly on the plans you can verify that the project is in compliance with the standards can be really time consuming. So we're trying to, this is sort of experimental, which is trying to put it more on the applicant to, and this can be challenging, especially for a lot of our applicants who are not land use consultants or law firms or architects. So we'll see, we're going to see how it goes. And it is quite long, which doesn't make us happy, and it doesn't include the guidelines in an effort to just keep it at a manageable length. But we're just hoping that it will help us speed up the process a bit and not have to go back and forth with the applicant so many times.
Yeah.
But we'll see.
I love that you're asking them to show you how they comply. I mean, we did sort of put it on them to you know, you have to request, if you want an exception, you have to provide a justification in writing and request it in writing as part of your application. But sort of, if they overlooked a standard and just were silent about it, we'd have to find it ourselves. So I think, you know, while this is 11 pages long, it's not as long as the 100 or so page standards and guidelines document.
So we actually have another great question in the chat. Pamela Campos asks, what specific elements are included that ensure women and children's access to mobility, recognizing that cities have been systematically planned and built with standards that reinforce class, race, gender inequalities? How is San Jose ensuring standards and guidelines are making spaces inviting to women and children who need access to education, employment, open space, and services available across the city?
That's a great question, Pamela, and a really super important topic. I mean, when we think about, you know, the next 100 years and the, you know, inequitable patterns that, you know, redlining and other things that kind of led to the urban fabric that we have today, couple that with the climate crisis, we really need to take big steps to make sure that everybody, and particularly people whose safety or mobility might not be at the same level as others, you know, have equitable access to everything that the city has to offer. So, you know, some of the ways that the guidelines tried to do that were really, I would say, the siting standards and guidelines that are pretty specific about if there is a major transit stop, you know, you need to orient your building such that it has a direct line of sight, you know, or, you know, you need to bring your building up to the street, you need to locate your entrance as close as possible to the transit stop. That's all designed to make it easier and safer and more comfortable, you know, to use transit, which is, you know, certainly for children, right? You know, if they're not able to drive, then they have to be driven around. So I think that transit access, and we also work pretty closely with VTA on those to ensure that their kind of transit access guidance was incorporated. We kind of touched on the affordable housing angle on all of this. I think that's another really key one. And then, you know, those smaller kind of infill housing opportunities with the missing middle types and ADUs and now, you know, duplexes through SB9 and things like that. I think just, you know, having good design guidance that reflects the evolving state of the state laws around all of these housing topics was also a way that we were kind of trying to raise the bar. It's a tough topic, and, you know, we did our best, but I'm sure there's more that can be done in the future as these get implemented and kind of vetted over time.
Ruchir or Carla, any other thoughts on?
In addition to the points that Tim already mentioned, we also addressed the paseos and public open spaces and visibility throughout, making sure that they are accessible to people from all realms, and they are like wide enough, and they have environment that's comfortable enough for anybody to walk through them and to access them, which again is really important when we're walking around those areas in evenings when it gets dark, like providing enough lighting in front of the building, all around the building, and then active frontages that we sort of touched upon earlier too, creating more transparent facades at the ground level, and minimizing the amount of blank walls, areas where you would not feel safe walking. So minimizing all of that, creating more engaging streets, creating connections between the building and between the inside of the building and the outside, all of that, and then limiting continuous building facades. Like after how many feet do you need to provide a paseo or a mid-block connection so that there are shorter walks? It's not a super block that you have to walk like more than 1,000 feet to be able to access the other block. So avoiding all of that, we try to include standards to make sure that that does not happen, and the public realm is safe for everybody, safe and welcoming for everybody.
And I think we've got one more little mini question just tagging onto that, whether San Jose encourages childcare facilities in high density environments. I don't know if anybody's got an answer for that.
I think they encourage, but not require. Yeah, to my knowledge, I mean, state law has kind of streamlined family childcare homes. I recently had to amend my ordinance here to allow, now they allow up to 14 children, you know, without any kind of discretionary review. You can have a state licensed childcare facility for up to 14 children in the provider's home. I know Santa and Lucas may know more about this as a former or maybe still current council aide, but in 2017 or 2018, the city adopted an ordinance on establishing a women's bill of rights, which is pretty interesting. And it talks about encouraging childcare as development occurs.
Great questions. I know we only have a few more minutes, and Fatima, I know that, oh, there's so many questions now. But you know, we'll try to take these questions and get back to you. But I know I wanted to just invite Rick Williams, who's our partner in charge for this project, to say a few words, and maybe there's some follow-up thoughts on some of those questions as well. So go ahead, Rick.
Thanks a lot, Elaine, and a great presentation to all of you. I really like to see the work presented by the people that really do it, and not the talking heads like me. But I just wanted to give some perspective on it. I remember distinctly when I was in college and Dan Solon was doing the residential design guidelines and standards for San Jose, and he was presenting to us about how this is the first time they were trying to go from suburbia to an urban community. And it was something that I really embraced throughout the next 35 years. And to have the ability to take some of those lessons that he taught us in school so many years ago, and I know Tim kind of went through the same stuff, so we're cut from the same cloth in a way, and then to be able to work with Tim to take these standards and really make them for the next generation. And it also tells us that these standards should be a living document that does get refined over time, because if you wait 30 years to do it the next time, I'm assured that these will look as out of date as the last ones did when we were looking at those and saying, well, hell, we can't use anything in these. Great principles. And I think the other thing we learned in 35 years is we don't have to do 300-page documents to get a good set of standards. We're trying to move the needle. We're trying to make the next generation of development at a higher quality and addressing the items that really care, that really matter. I distinctly remember discussing with Dan and others that if an architect comes into design review and gets the committee to argue over the color of the awning, then they've probably not been paying enough attention to the fact that the parking is in the front on the corner of the lot, on the corner lot. And you've got the entry in the wrong place, you've got the parking in the wrong place, your facade is a blank wall on the street, but you've got that purple awning that you really fought for. And that's missing the whole point. So there's really 10 or 12 key principles and elements to this document that we think will stand the test of time. They'll still get revised, they'll still get changed, but they'll stand the test of time and probably be the same principles that the next generation of standards and guidelines is built upon as well. And I just want to thank you all for doing such a great job presenting this. Yeah, I love the questions in here. And if this could be 2 hours, I'm sure we could have a great conversation about that as well. Also, it is Affordable Housing Week, a month. We're having, there's a lot of great events. Please go out and see as many of them as you can. I've already was attending, I couldn't start this one off because I was attending a groundbreaking, and now I'm going off to a ribbon cutting. Wow. Or almost a ribbon cutting. So just want to thank you all. Elaine for helping really push this on, Tim for being the instigator to all of it, and Carla and Ruchira for really pulling it all off. So I really appreciate what you all have done, and appreciate that everybody was able to participate today and listen in. And if you have further questions, you can always contact us and we'll provide you any information that you might need.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Elaine. Thanks, everybody.
No, thank you all for joining. This is fantastic. Great questions, great discussion. Really appreciate all of your interest in affordable housing and everything. And thank you, Regina, for joining us. And Allison, all the SV at Home folks. We'll be sure to share the slides and post the video. So thanks so much. All right. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Bye, thanks.